Hey everybody, welcome back to Tools of the Trade. Today we're going to be talking about something kind of near and dear to my heart. It's a massive collection that I've put together over the years, which is chasing and repousse punches and chisels. They are tools that are used in several different ways, both for creating lines and creating forms in hard work, where you might be working like you've seen Ilya do directly into the surface of a blade, where we're working on a hard piece of steel. They can also be used like you saw Ellen and Derek doing, where on the different pieces that we've done with all the lions, where we're creating lofting in sheet metal, either hot work or in cold, or what we call room temperature work or cold work, where you're hammering from one side, filling with pitch, and then working from the front side to create your detail. Obviously it's a little more elaborate than that, but that's the basic form. And then the final form is where we're actually kind of removing metal and then forming the shape of the material that's left. And we'll talk a little bit about that, but that'll be following in a bigger episode about engraving itself, where we'll talk about the difference between what you're doing when you're pushing the metal around, when you're chasing it, and when you're engraving it, where we're actually cutting and taking the material away and then chasing to get our surfaces the way that we want. Let's talk about what we're doing when we're working on a hard piece of metal first. And that could be something where we're working on a master hub or die for creating a piece of jewelry, or it could be, as you've seen us do here on Man-at-Arms, it could be where we're working directly on the surface of a sword or on sword parts, where we're cutting into it and then chasing those surfaces to create that. Typically that work is started out with what we call a liner. A liner is a very straight surface, typically, unless we're working in a curved liner, which is obviously then curved. So a curved liner would be something that would have a shape like this, where the face would actually be curved around, and rather than that just being what you'd think of as a punch where you hit it one time and it strikes that curve into the surface, we actually can tap, 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 tap and work this piece around and create a circle or create, an arc or anything like that. So we would change what we would use for these cutters, both the form so that we know how deep we're going, and it would allow us to, as we work that and change it, we would be able to change that arc. So typically what you want is the largest, straightest chisel that you can find to fit in to do the design that you want, because that'll give you the least number of tooling marks. What we don't want is what you think of as stamping, which is essentially where you're taking that chisel, you're setting on the material, you're striking it once, then you're moving the chisel to the next position and striking it again. That work is not typically considered high quality work. Now there is an exception to that rule, which I'm going to show you, which is when each one of these chisels has a very ornate face on it. And in this case, we even have faces. We have a whole series of chisels that are tiny hands and crowns and things of that nature, that when you're creating something, you've made that high detailed thing one time and you can impart it directly onto the surface of your work with a single stamp. That is not typically considered chasing and repousse. That is stamping, but it does have a place in the same work. Even if you're engraving, and you wouldn't want to have to engrave a hand over and over again if you had a whole series of people. If you had a tiny stamp that was a hand, it could be marked and then it could be oriented for each person that was in that work, in that artwork that you were doing. So that's a little bit different. So we're going to work with something that's going to be more of, let's look at something that would be a straight liner. So this would be what you'd think of as just a straight chisel, but this is a liner. So this would actually allow you to, when you strike it, you slightly tilt it and drive it with a hammer. And what you don't want is, you don't want to see this leading edge striking over and over again. So typically the very edges of these have been relieved with a polish. We would use a Scotch-Brite wheel for that, which would give us a very soft finish at the end, even if we made the chisel very sharp to start with. That way, as we're hammering it and going along a line, there'd be no visual that it was anything other than maybe a carved out line, even though what we're doing is displacing metal. You would take your artwork and lay it directly onto a piece of material, like this test piece that I was working with. This was just something where I kind of had a basic idea of maybe making a brooch that I would start from here. And so I just hand sketched right on the surface. And then you go through where you want to make those changes in height initially, and you would use your liner, and that liner would be cut into the surface. I say cut in, it's not actually cut, it's pushing the metal. You don't want to cut it when you're talking about a piece of copper that's only this thick. And then you come back through with something smooth that you can drive that surface down with. So it may be a chisel more like this that's got, you know, smoothed overall, and you work that whole surface area. Once again, you want to use essentially whatever the largest chisel that'll fit in an area that you have. That's what you want to use because it has the least number of tooling marks as you go through. And then your backgrounds are created. In this case, I was making some flames. So the chisel that I was using for the final work on the shape of those flames, and I can show you another example of that in a little bit, that's actually a chisel that's got a sandy surface on it that I create by taking a polished chisel and then hammering it onto the surface of a diamond file. So the diamond file, which is kind of like a shark skin kind of feeling surface on it, we'd then be able to put that onto the hardened chisel, and then that would impart it onto the copper, and that kind of gives you different shading in the shapes as you go, as you create those shapes. So that's the type of thing that we would do. If you wanted a more radical background, you wanted a background that was deep and stipply, that had a very different form, then you could use deep texturing punches like these guys. These deep texturing punches are created typically by driving something into the surface, or perhaps you could cut in them with a graver while this material is still soft before we harden the chisels. And that's something we can pick up in an entirely different video we'll talk about. But then this becomes that coarse background. Just to give you a basic idea of where I learned that type of thing, I took a class with Tom Herman at Seven Fingers Jewelry, and Tom taught me some carving work where we were working directly in gold. So we were actually taking our designs, cutting the surface, drilling through to the inside of a gold ring, and then we would chase and create leaves on the surface of that. And I'll show you an example of that, although the tooling for that is tiny and slightly different as far as the way that we're working. I have all the tools here. Now, those are tools that I made, not tools that I bought. So we would go into a class with somebody like Tom Herman, we would make that tool specific for the task that we were doing. While I was at that class working at Metal Kitchen with Whitney Abrams up in New York, we went to see Valentin Yutkov, who is a Bulgarian master silversmith, who I then worked with many times and spent many, many hours with him. And when I went to his class the first time, I spent some time online. We'll put that PDF up where you can see it and see what his basic set of chisels are. The work that Valentin was creating was slightly different because he basically was looking for something that would create a specific historical look from the pieces that you would see in Bulgaria. And so that series of chisels kind of creates that form. This is another example of the work that I was doing. I was just kind of doing a study on maybe the side of a pirate cutlass. I really hadn't decided at the time. But this was actually, I was working in Valentin Yutkov's studio in Brooklyn, in New York. And these are the chisels that I made that all of this was done with these chasing tools. So this series of chasing tools are the general design that Valentin uses to create his work. And while I was working with him, I was kind of working as a study on these flames to kind of get an idea of general form. And I had a wax skull with me that we use on one of our pirate cutlasses, just to kind of look and kind of make sure that it was the same general form and shape. This material that's in the background is called pitch, and this pitch is a resistance that allows you to basically forge the material down into it while it's pushing back and giving you support. It's in a steel bowl. This steel bowl came from Kirk Steef and is reportedly actually a slice off of a cannonball, which is certainly possible because I'd heard that from many different people at Kirk Steef before they went out of business. And the cannonballs were made here in Baltimore, so it was not something that was as far-fetched as it might sound like in different places. So these tools tend to be a little bit bigger than what Valentin would normally work with when he's teaching classes, but I do have an entire set of basically everything that he makes. A friend of mine, Stephen O'Meara at O'Meara Silver, passed away recently, and I met with his widow, who's become a pretty good friend, and I bought his entire collection. And so this is a full set of ones that are actually made by Valentin Jakob, and kind of a prized possession for me. These allow you to do all of this kind of work all the way down to almost the tiniest sizes. When we get into tiny work, that's when we're typically not working in sheet anymore. We're working in something solid. And if I can, I prefer to be working either in silver or gold once I get into something small, which is obviously when the material gets to be a little more affordable. So let's take a look at some of that as well. So in some of those classes, we're working in some of Valentin's designs. So we knew that we were going to be working on vessels. So initially, what I did was Valentin supplied us with these as spinnings, which, you know, we cleaned up and made very nice so that they would take a nice surface. And then this was filled with pitch. This was left fully hardened. So that allowed us to cut in and do the detail work, and you can see the texturing work in this as well. That allowed it to maintain its form. This guy's a little bit different. So this started out as a flat disc. I think it was about 7.5 inches across in 16 gauge silver. This is sterling silver, which I then annealed and raised. So we basically are hammering the cup up rather than creating our depth by hammering the center down. When you hammer the center down, the problem with that is that you are stretching the material, and as you stretch the material, it gets thinner. If you know that you're going to try and create this detail work on the outside, you don't want your material to be thinner because you cut right through it. So what we do with something like this is it's hammered up, and as it's hammered up, the circumference that's out here, that, like I said, 7.5 inches, is compressed until it reaches something like this, which is probably a little under 3 inches. So all of that material that was out here has been pushed here, making this thicker, making the thinnest part of this entire cup the material that you started with at the bottom. That gives you enough thickness and enough form to come back in. We fill once again with pitch to create our resistance, and come back in and lay the detail. You'll notice that here we're still somewhat flat because we haven't pushed the background. Here we've pushed the background down with a texturing punch, and it's given that to us. But if you look, I'm using the same tools on essentially the same material because pure copper and sterling silver move in a very similar fashion. Here we're working on something that's annealed, where the material is soft, and as you can see, these squares are slightly puffy, whereas when we're working on the harder copper, which is just a hardened material, like I said, the materials themselves move the same. It's the state of the material that mattered. Those crisscrosses are actually very flat. I mean, they appear that I've actually removed the material by engraving when I haven't. This is chased, and if you look inside the cup, you can see the design where it's been pushed through. But still very flat on the outside versus the soft silver that creates that kind of puffy form and gives you kind of a bigger lofted design. It's a little more interesting, I think, but it was a good design study and a good way to learn. We get into some of the harder work, and then we change to what are much smaller tools, and these tools actually are fairly sharp on the end because even though we're displacing the metal, we are cutting into the material itself rather than just trying to push it a little bit to create that form. So a ring like this, these are 14 karat gold. This started out as just a plain smooth wedding band, just a scrap wedding band that had been turned into a scrapper somewhere that I purchased from them. And then we go through and cut the basic design, do some relief work where this is actually pierced all the way through to the inside, and then we actually chase and form those leaves by hammering rather than necessarily just carving like you would have seen Ference do on something where everything that he's doing is he's removing material. I'm not really removing material other than the basic drill to get to the piercing for the background. After that, I'm just pushing that material around, and on certain things, you can see it where you can actually move material dramatically. Now in fine silver and in higher karat golds, 18 and 22, and certainly in 24 karat gold, you can move material dramatically, even around to the other side of the ring. You could start with a ring that was the same on one side and push that material so that that ring would be twice as thick on one side and, you know, half the thickness on the other, because it's just one of those things. It kind of depends on what your design is. So this is an example where it basically shows from the form of the ring, fairly plain, you cut around that outside edge, and then as we work through it, it slowly becomes the finished piece that shows you those finished leaves. So this was my design study when I did this diamond ring, and I saved this so that whenever I start these projects, I can go back and take a look and make a decision of what tool that I'm using. I have tiny surfaces here, matte finishes that are very, very small, so that I can go in to get in small areas and still create that to give the shading that gives that really deep look. So it's fairly different from a lot of these other tools where we're trying to create a surface, but we're not necessarily moving a huge amount of material based on, you know, the overall size. A lot of material moved in this ring. This ring still needs a little bit of finish work, but it has a little over 30 hours in it just in the carving time, not even counting laying in the setting and doing the diamond set as well. Now for something very different, and something that I feel very lucky to have found and been able to purchase. I was talking to a gentleman that lives in my area who was an engraver, and he was primarily making wax signet rings. That was the main thing that he was doing throughout his career. And one of his prized possessions he had bought, I think in 1950 when he was in Germany apprenticing. He had found a series of punches and chasing tools that were used to create signet rings, very specifically to create heraldry, and that's what I have here in these tiny little ones. Now, you know that these are very early, because as you get into later work, you find longer and longer chisels. Material was, I guess, a bit more scarce for the high quality material that it requires for this, and so many of these are tiny and are just simply laid out different. But these have tiny little faces and hands and crowns and lions heads and eagle heads, and they are tiny, tiny things. Typically these are used to emboss directly into the surface of a high karat gold ring that would be used as a wax seal. So you have a positive here, it would be hammered into the surface of the ring, and then the ring itself would be used to press into the wax, and that would give you a positive, showing you the actual figures in the wax itself. And so you could use it for sealing letters and sealing documents and things like that. And this technique goes back as far really as metalworking goes back. So I can't really tell you when these are from, but they certainly are very early. There's actually a fair number of skulls and faces in here, so there's certainly some very interesting things, and we'll show you a whole bunch of this. Some of the neatest ones, there are some tiny, tiny fists, and the fact that you could do those hands like I talked about by simply hammering that in, and you would orient it for each different person's arm or hand or whatever that was in your design work, I think is very fascinating, because it certainly would be extremely hard to cut that many hands when, you know, a master could do that on a punch like this, and then it could even be passed off to somebody who is learning, and they could still create that general look by using the master's hand that would have been permanently set into a chasing tool like this. So in closing, I just really wanted to kind of invite you guys in to see this type of collection. You will find it with many different people that are in the jewelry industry. When we find things like this, we tend to hold on to them because you never know what you're going to need. And often you need the tool that no matter how many you have, you simply don't have. And so learning to make your own is actually very important. And I'll definitely be doing a video for you guys on how to create that and how to keep the textures. Creating some of the simpler forms is really about learning how the tool moves and how the tool works. Creating some of the things that have very specific textures or tiny figurative work, and keeping that figurative work from being destroyed in the heat treating and polishing stages. It's not as complicated as it might sound, but it is very important that you follow the steps in a certain way and use certain materials for it. And I'm happy to impart that knowledge to you. So make sure that you come back and kind of watch what we're going to be doing. Like and subscribe to this channel. We are constantly going to be adding on to this series, and we welcome you to come back and watch it with us. Click the logo to subscribe, or click one of the videos to see more here on the Baltimore Knife and Sword channel, or go to Almy and watch Man at Arms.